I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Errata and tabletop RPGs.
That's right.
So one of the things to keep in mind, let's say that you just published a tabletop RPG book, and then the feedback has started coming in, or you've looked back through it and you're saying, oh my gosh, there's a typo here, there's a grammatical error here, I said reflex save here where I meant to say will save, that doesn't make any sense. I have all these things that I want to go back and change. Now what do I do?
So, when it comes to any book or product or thing that you're going to make, unless I suppose it's literally like a book that only has like one sentence in it or something that, you're never going to get everything perfect. You can do 50 edit passes. And with a book of the kind of length that many major tabletop RPG releases are, it's literally impossible to get everything correct. Even if your 50th edit pass will, it'll fix some number of things, but it might create another error or two, because that's just what happens.
Or, there's something that you people just glossed over. You've ever seen like those challenges where they have this sentence where like the word "the" appears at the beginning of one line and the end of the previous line, and you just don't see it.
Yeah. Or where the problem that was created during edit pass 50 was that nothing that's grammatically wrong or like obviously incorrect, but that before you did 50 passes, the original wording was written in such a way to try to stop some of the readers from like interpreting it in multiple ways, including one way that could be problematic and causing online arguments.
And then
after the 50th pass, it doesn't do that anymore, because like that very specific wording, which had other things about it that might have caused it to be changed, was changed. So like there's no way you're going to get everything perfect and completely all ducks in a row. And so therefore you need something like Errata. And when it comes to video games obviously put these out as patches. They put out balance patches, they put out patches that fix errors, they put out patches that add content. That's kind of what people are used to when it comes to what they expect from something like Errata in a book for a tabletop RPG.
And Rohit's talking about defining what Errata is. Rohit says, I feel like people, even Paizo, consider balance patches to be Errata as well. Strictly speaking, Errata is just correcting mistake. Balance patches are just new content, IMO.
So, Errata in tabletop RPGs is a topic that can be a little narrower or a little wider depending on what you're talking about in terms of how to deal with it. Because sometimes Errata can actually just be fixing a mistake, but also be viewed as a balance patch by the community if the mistake was that the wording was wrong and it led to a broken interpretation of the text, or two interpretations, one of which was problematic, or anything like that. It could just be literally there was an error in the book, and when you fix it, it looks like it is a balance patch, when really it's just like this was never intended to say what it currently says. Maybe like you typoed a number. Like for an extreme example, in Starfinder First Contact for Starfinder First Edition, there was a case where like something was doing like a D8 or a D10. I'm not sure which it was originally doing. And it was changed from either from a D8 to a D10 or from a D10 to a D8. But they forgot to delete the old number. And so it wound up being a D810. Okay? So when the Circassian rifle was changed from the D810, which at a fun PaizoCon Delve, Joe Piscini actually ran it with the 810. And against like a PC with like 30 hit points, he rolled like just below, like he rolled like 20 or something on D810. It didn't kill them. And he was like, what? But obviously, correcting the D810 is going to be something that weakens that particular rifle, but it's not really a balanced pass. It's a fix. And so when you talk about the errata process, you really have a wider process that can also include things like issuing a clarification or frequently asked questions that will actually like possibly really change things from what the community or some portion of the community thought that it was. If there is a prevailing interpretation that is not the same as the designers, there is flat out errata. That's when you make changes to the book. Generally, that does include making any change that you're going to make that is going to go into the next printing of the book, or even before the book's next printing is available. So the question that we put in here of why don't tabletop RPGs issue more errata and other errata secrets, it comes down with errata to the fact that everything that happens in the errata process involves both internal and external pressures on a given company.
So, I mean, internally, one of the main pressures is the time and effort that it takes to go back and generate the errata, which you could otherwise be spending on making new products.
It's resources. Pretty much every tabletop RPG company does not have enough resources for all the things that they're trying to do. And errata, like Linda said, is something that does not directly generate money. This can make it difficult to prioritize when a project release that was promised for Gen Con, for example, is on fire and desperately needs help. And be like, well, but we also kind of want to do this errata right now. So internal pressure, resources. That is a big one. Another internal pressure that can go towards making errata is perfectionism among the internal staff and designers. Like, for instance, I want to get everything right. So I'm someone who is usually putting pressure towards doing more errata and making more fixes, because I'm just someone who's like, I can't stand it if there's like, especially a major error that's in there and we can't fix it. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of an internal pressure, would be people in the company who want to fix everything if they can.
I think another one would be compatibility / interactivity with other products. That's
correct. So, for example, one of the major restrictions on errata that you will see is that it can't shift the page number of where things are in for Paizo or any other company that has a lot of books that reference each other by page number. And so for that reason, for example, like, it's been on the record already, like well before the remaster, that there would have been more kind of more and different changes to the Alchemist than there were in the errata that already had happened to the Alchemist in later printings of the core rulebook, if not for the fact that it needed to take the exact same number of pages and be roughly everything in the same place as it was before, so that anything else that referenced the Alchemist had the right page numbers for all of its components.
That's a hard limit, and actually that's really interesting, because that's not the one I was initially thinking about. The one I was initially thinking about is like, if you make one change but there's a lot of other mechanics that are predicated on the way that it originally was, does that then create an errata avalanche where you then have to like clarify things?
That is an errata. That would be an errata avalanche.
Yeah.
Because if you're
right, page number errata avalanche.
Yes,
I was thinking about mechanical errata avalanche, but they're similar.
If you changed the pagination of everything, like let's say that you were like, we need to add 2 more pages to the Alchemist, which, by the way, one of the worst things. At least Ancestries come before classes, but one of the worst places to put it because it's the first class alphabetically. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, we can't remove 2 pages. This is our core rule book. Mm-hmm. So if you did that and you convinced them to not add a whole signature, which is a whole other story, everything in the entire core rule book is mm-hmm. now wrong by 2 pages. Which means every page citation in every other book needs errata as well. Mm-hmm. That as long as it comes starting from the Alchemist and going forward in the core rulebook, as long as it's not an ancestry or a background or in the introduction, and that can be a big problem. Now, when you're putting out a new edition or a not an edition like the remaster where it's kind of an edition but it's not really all the way there and is not branded as an edition, those are not errata because it's actually a new product at that point. Mm-hmm. And that also allows for a clean break where you don't have some of those same restrictions and you don't mind if there's going to be some small incompatibilities because it's a new pseudo edition or a full edition.
But the remaster also did trigger errata of previous content to make it more similar to the content of the remaster. So it's an interesting little...
Yes.
It's an interesting giant conundrum.
Absolutely. And so... we talked about some of the internal pressures, but there are also external pressures towards the errata process as well.
I want to just Roy talks about how a theory that could be potentially be automated to automatically correct page references. That could work for let's say you had a fully. Some things might be able to be if you had a fully integrated online system.
If it was fully digital somehow.
It was fully digital and it said, okay, this content is on this page and so this flag does a page reference to this content or something like that. But then if you have, somebody has a printed book that's not and they're not on the exact same version, even if you say, okay, we're going to release all new books coming forward have this, then it's not the exact same version, then it's going to be an issue.
So... it just definitely, despite the suggestion, and before we move on to the thing that we're going to move on to, it definitely can't work for a print RPG. Now, if you're moving towards being almost fully digital, you might be able to. But not only do companies usually, not have the main version of the files they're working on to be something that's automatically interrelatable mm-hmm. like that, it's usually in, InDesign files that aren't interconnected in that same way. But even if they were, even if the company had it so that the company's internal files that were used to work on everything somehow automatically updated, which is fairly non-trivial for most RPG companies to do. Yeah, like Linda said, your books don't. And if you're updating, say, the core rulebook by adding 2 pages to Alchemist and therefore causing every page reference after that to be off, sure, you'll get another printing of that. Maybe some other major books, but there are going to be a ton of books that reference the core rulebook that will never get another printing again, and now every page reference in them are wrong forever.
And even if you were a PDF only, is everyone who's using your book always downloading the latest version of the PDF?
That's right.
Or does somebody have an older,
Well, this is going to move into... even though we went in the weeds because there's a question in chat, this is going to move into the other major thing, which is external pressures on errata. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're listening to this and you heard me talking about internal pressures, you probably are thinking about the external pressure of people who are asking, why isn't there more errata? Mm-hmm. And that is an external pressure that helps lead towards errata. Perfectionists inside the company can only get resources that are added to things up to a certain point. If there wasn't some external pressure of people sort of asking for more errata, then it would be harder to justify adding more resources to errata. Another external pressure that is sort of actually halfway in between an external and an internal pressure as well is that sometimes there is a new printing of the book that is going to be coming out because a certain number of people bought the first book. Mm-hmm. This one gets pretty interesting because of the way, as we'll see later, that it causes a weird perverse incentive with errata. Mm-hmm. But once the book is about to run out and you're going to print another one, then the question becomes, are you gonna, you know that there's a huge error in it. Are you gonna print it again with the same huge error?
So you can fix it, right? If you change it. But then if you change it, then all the copies of that old book become books that are out of date and not inherently not as valuable.
So that is true. And that is part of the other external pressure. And this other external pressure is one that a lot of people don't know about unless they were playing for a long time in 4th edition D&D, which, a lot of us did play during that era a decent amount, but many people started in the 5e D&D era or were more on Pathfinder or anything else. And so, or played 4e D&D but weren't really like following all the errata, or weren't into the industry as much as you are now when you're watching YouTube channels about it. And so one of the other external pressures that you might not know about, especially if you're watching this because you're part of the people who, like me, want everything to be fixed, is the pressure of being able to adapt to the errata. Now, if this was a patch in a computer game where it just auto downloads itself
and then it
auto applies itself into your code, and now that's it, it's happened, you didn't have to do anything except maybe click yes on downloading the patch
and wait a few minutes and then it's done.
That'd be great. But one of the external pressures is it's actually quite burdensome to apply errata to your physical product. And if you are dealing with the physical product as sort of your main way of dealing with things, you have to get an errata file that lists the changes, and then you have to decide whether you're going to just always carry that along or memorize it, or write it into your book. Maybe you're someone like me who really doesn't like the idea of writing in your book. You put a post-it note on it, perhaps. And the thing about that
download an errata PDF and have it printed out, or have it with you, or all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So, yeah, the thing about that is 4th edition D&D was perhaps, as far as I know of, one of the most conscientious in terms of fixing everything. And they fixed everything regularly, and they sometimes had to fix it multiple times to get the fixes through. And if you're someone who is like, what's going on? Why are Company X not issuing a lot of errata? And you weren't there in that era, you might not know this, but a lot of people got really upset about how many errata they were. They got errata fatigue. They're like, what is even going on? I have so many post-it notes and post-it notes on my post-it notes. I'm writing into my book, but then that's getting written into. What am I even doing? Why is there so much errata? And so the issue is, if you give too many errata, it can be burdensome for the public, especially using physical books, to apply it. And not only that, but moving back to what Linda said, it gives a perception that their first printing book was bad, and that having a first printing of anything can sometimes be like a prestige thing, or feel good and be like, I have a first printing of this. That's like really special. There were only a certain number of amount that were made. But you have this other pressure against it where it's like, no, but this first printing could be like really wrong. And maybe I should just wait.
Yeah, wait till the second printing.
Wait for the second printing. It'll have all those errata in it. Assuming that our answer to the question of do we allow huge errors to be in the second printing is no.
Yeah.
But then if
and
this is a prisoner's dilemma game,
then you depress initial sales, and then do they actually come back and buy the next thing? And then then you don't get a second printing. Then you don't get a second printing, and then that never happened. Yeah, so that never happened. So then you also have the issue of, let's say that, if second printing's different from first printing, say, then everywhere you have tables where some people have first printing and some people have second printing, and then anytime that happens, they're going to have a discussion about, do they implement the errata? How do they implement the errata? Do characters, do characters need some retraining based on the changes of the mechanics, or their larger changes that might be at play? Do they retcon certain things? How are they going to do it for each change that exists?
And the issue can become whether or not everyone at your table has kept up with the errata.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if you have multiple different printings of the book and nobody watches the errata at all, you might have a situation where you're reading something very, very different than the other person, and neither of you even knows that there was a possibility that it would be that different.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of interesting use case factors that come into having a physical version of the book with errata. But ultimately, 4E kind of was the experiment of issuing errata like really often and to make sure everything was as right as possible.
Yeah,
and anyone in the industry who has been through being in 4E, who has heard from people who worked at Wizards of the Coast at the time, is noticeably more skittish about trying to release large amounts of errata and very rapidly and with lots of patches of errata.
Yeah. So, and then another thing is, like, even if it's a purely digital resource, people might be confused when they go back to something and it doesn't do what they expect it to, or it doesn't match, any notes that they have made for themselves about how does my character work, or things like that.
That's right. And so there's a few things that the companies do, the bigger companies do when they're making errata around these large product lines to try to get around some of these internal and external constraints, but allow them to match the enthusiasm of both internal folks who are perfectionists and external folks who want things fixed. One of these is to issue errata that are either updates or corrections and separate those out. So what do I mean by updates or corrections? So sometimes when you get a second printing of, let's say, a Paizo book, and you look at your errata from the first printing, and you're like, okay, yeah, I see. There are these errata. It's like, yeah, these are all pretty substantial. I see why all of these happened. And yeah, okay, this isn't too many. But what you don't see on that list, you might wonder about this. You might be like, does Paizo not really fix typos unless it's causing an internet argument or something like that? Did they never catch them? And the answer is, well, they aren't listed on the updates for errata that are sent out to people for multiple reasons. One of them is it makes it easier for you to use the errata listing if it has 25 things that might actually change your game in a 500-page book, instead of listing 400 things, 375 of which completely don't matter.
Which is like, this comma should have been a period.
Yes,
like, that's not going to...
This comma should have been a semicolon.
Yeah.
Or, the letter S is written twice here, or there's a the at the end of the line and a the at the beginning of the next line in this point.
Or like the way that this word wrapped around the art was a little bit awkward, so we moved it back by changing the kerning in this line.
That's right.
Like, yeah.
But which changed where things were line to line, but didn't move anything onto a different page.
Yeah.
And so those kind of errata, giving them as public updates literally makes the errata document worse and harder to use. It also helps in terms of just like the feel of how many errata there are in the book towards like having the first book, if you don't like have a constant reminder that there are all these other small changes, but it's mainly for usability. Now, there is a pitfall to this, which I have seen before, which is basically, if you do not have someone involved in your errata process, and not even just involved, because sometimes there can be like, like debates of whether something is an update or a correction, and one person says this and one person says that, and you have to make a decision. If the decision is not made based on extensive knowledge of potentially like picayune online debates, sometimes you can wind up saying that something is not listed as an update that actually matters to, some group of people who were actually having a conflict over it, because the person who's deciding maybe didn't know about that conflict is like, oh, this is just a tiny thing with a comma, like Linda said.
Yeah.
We just added a comma in this one place. That's the typical thing that you wouldn't update. But it turned out that the lack of the comma had led to a huge argument that you could gain infinity hit points or something like that.
Yeah, and the person who was reading it didn't see both readings. They saw one reading, and so they're just like, they fix it, but then, yeah, they don't know about the...
Right. So...
Or they're like, oh yeah, nobody would read it this way. Or it's clearly this. Like, clearly is a dangerous word.
That's right.
When it comes to thousands of people reading the same book.
And so sometimes you will have a few things that get not put into the updates, but that somebody somewhere was actually did care about. It wasn't just like the comma that didn't really do anything, but was technically more grammatically correct, or like a British spelling of gray with an EY that you changed to an AY or something where it's like nobody anywhere cares except for us. And so this actually can lead to some issues, and you'll have points of time where I've even seen online sometimes that has led to like almost not even full-on conspiracies, but things where people are like, oh my gosh, this company has they left it out of the errata because they didn't want us to know that that it was there, because they just kind of want to slip it past because they knew that we'd be mad that they put that comma in there and they cut off the infinite thing. And it's like, no, it's because somebody who was deciding which one it was not the same person who knew why that was causing a conflict, but everyone unanimously agreed to put it in because it was grammatically more correct or something like that. So, these are sort of the principles behind which errata are shared and which ones are sort of just done, right? Yeah. However, it can't decide when errata will happen. And for a lot of companies, it does come down to the next printing, because that is basically the last possible moment. And if a company is understaffed enough, then everything comes down to the last possible moment, right? And for errata, that last possible moment will not happen until the book is like, okay, well, if we don't do this now, the next book will not have these errata. Whereas every other product they're making will have a thing was like, oh, well, this is the adventure path for this month. Yeah. It has to go out this month, or we will skip a month. Yeah. Or this is the release for Gen Con. Or we said this release to everybody was going to be on July 15th. Or whatever that is. Those will always be considered to have more pressure
until it becomes the most urgent thing. Yeah.
And trust me, I've seen this happen where basically there was a huge sales spike at one point for every book. And then there were 6 products that all needed errata, and they all needed it now, where now is not literally now when you're watching this video, it was the time that it was happening. And that can get real interesting real fast, for sure. But that's the reason why things happen that way in general. So I want to talk about is there a way to fix this? Like, people have mentioned in chat, Rohit suggested a lot earlier, what if you have a way that everything's connected and auto fixes the pages? I believe that there is, but it doesn't work really at all with the business models of Wizards of the Coast or Paizo or any other company that is going to be releasing the PDF at the same time as the hardcover. And this is the errata model that Roll for Combat uses. And I think, honestly, Steve and I are both perfectionists. And so we have a lot of internal pressure because we're the only 2 people who really make a decision over to whether to fix things, and we generally will always say yes.
Yeah, I remember talking to Steven earlier on about like this whole principle that you're never going to have a perfect book. And he's like, but.
He's like, but I want to. I think I can. We're going to do it. We're going to try. And he wants to someday to do one. And even though the process that happened at Roll for Combat was not intended entirely to create an excellent errata pipeline, it happened to do so almost by accident. So I'll just tell you in this video, in case you are thinking of starting your own tabletop company or wondering how it could be done differently. And here's how it works. basically, we release all of the PDFs for, if you have like a Battle Zoo Ancestries Dragons or something like that. The PDF is released as soon as it's ready to everyone. And then, if anybody finds anything that could be an erratum in that PDF, and they send it to us, then we check it out, see if it is or not. This does take a decent amount of resources if you get enough of those. Having been the person at Paizo who sometimes goes through community reports, because sometimes the report is wrong, sometimes the report is repeated, sometimes the report is written in such a way that it tells a change that is the wrong change, but really there is an error and something else needs to happen. It takes a while to go through, but you go through all of those, and then that can be applied before the first printing of the book comes out. And that allows you to have your cake and eat it too, with a first printing that is as accurate as possible while still it's basically a first printing that
has the second printing
worth of accuracy. It's not still going to be completely perfect, but it's a huge increase, because usually that first printing to the second printing is where you catch a lot of things.
Yep, because when I say, like, you're not going to get it perfect, like, I'm naturally a perfectionist, and that's something that I've had to learn. It's just, like, you don't need to drive yourself up a wall trying to catch thinking, oh no, I missed this one thing. You do your best, you do multiple passes, and then what you publish is what you publish.
The perfect is the enemy of the good and the enemy of being done. Mm-hmm. And so, if you get too caught up in thinking that it has to be completely perfect before you even submit it the first time, you'll just never submit it. And you will have diminishing returns as well. Mm-hmm. So, I think that in order for tabletop RPGs to be able to engage in the errata process in different ways, it would require a major pipeline shifts that are not really going to necessarily happen. I mean, maybe if D&D becomes mainly digital, with the books becoming more of a collector's item along the line, as, for instance, Stephen Glicker has predicted that it would. And then, like, the digital version, it becomes, like, the main version. Maybe that would allow them to update, like Rohit suggested, with, fixes and patches and things like that are just automated. And the idea that it doesn't apply to the books is just like, well, that's fine, because the books are not the main product. But until the day where that happens, it's always going to be an issue with the pressures of print publishing that make errata quite different from what's going on in a balance patch.
It's been interesting seeing in chat, though, that a different view that, like, there are folks who really enjoy the process of updating their books and putting in the notes and having a book that feels like it's been well used and well loved through over the years. So it's not a universal
everyone
opinion.
has a different point of view. Listen. It's not that the community is just going to have double standards. It's that, or not double standards, that's not the right word for it, but it's not the community is going to be damned if you do, damned if you don't. Mm-hmm. It's that some segment of the community feels a certain way and some feels the other way, and the one you're going to hear from is the one that's upset with whatever you're currently doing. Correct. So let's talk about at least one more secret of tabletop RPG errata.
Before we get into that, I want to address one other comment. Was digital first feels pretty risky for sale physical books, like it works for you guys because you pre-sold books on Kickstarter?
Yes, so it can work. It just depends on the situation. For example, you could also use it with pre-sold books that are not on Kickstarter, right? Like, just imagine, if you will, that a company decides to, I'm just going to use Paizo. I don't think they're going to ever decide to do this, but what if Paizo had a perk for subscribers of their Pathfinder products? And this perk for subscribers of their Pathfinder products was that they would not just would they get the PDF, like, whenever it happens to be shipped in the box, but the subscription perk would say something like, as a perk of subscribers, you can turn on early bird mode. If you do, you will be charged a month in advance, or pick any number of times that you want, for your product, and then you will get the PDF then. but it could be more than a month in advance. It could be like super early bird mode. Now, obviously, this changes a lot of things about the buzz of releases, so they might not be able to do it as soon as it was available. But if it was a month in advance, that's not nearly enough time to make errata changes. It would have to be more like 5 or
months
6
or so.
months.
Yeah, because they have to. Yeah, so that's the thing, right? It's how much does your company focus on the importance of the physical book as a sales model? Is it okay to say, hey, if doing this means that I sell more PDFs and fewer physical books,
well, it could also be that you had to have ordered a physical book to get that PDF early, right? Maybe only a physical order. If you want to be physical first and do this, maybe it's like if you have subscribed to the physical Lost Omens line or whatever, then you get this book. You get the PDF 6 months early. Like that's a can't beat deal for the people who got it, obviously, and that would be something I think that would make a lot of people upset in certain ways. It would cause weird buzz issues where the buzz for whatever's in the book is 6 months before most people can get it. And then when it actually
comes out, then it's like it's not the new exciting.
What happened for the Player's Handbook in Dungeons and Dragons, where they gave it out early in so many different ways that when it was actually released, nobody was really talking about it a lot.
Also, that goes back to what you were talking about with Kickstarter and things like that, because then Kickstarter generates an early buzz cycle for a book, and the book's actual release date isn't its primary buzz cycle. So it is a different model, and it's interesting to think about the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of doing things.
Rowan's wondering what's the typical time interval between a book being ready, like the PDF being ready and the release date. It's got to be usually somewhere around 5 to 6 months, because just purely printing it takes at least 3 months. And so basically that's where you're getting with that. So if we're going to talk about errata, we're also going to want to talk about one more thing that has some interesting pressures on it, which is when you errata something that is, let's say, it was not what you intended to put into the book, but it's not obviously like a typo or mistake. Like it was just miswritten and it leads to an interpretation that is like way too weak or way too strong, or something that will appear to be a power level errata. Or in some cases, it just is because you wrote it and your mistake was thinking that it was a good idea to include the thing that you put in because it was actually busted.
Whether because it's too powerful on its own,
or it was really
it
weak.
interacts with, or too weak on its own, or because it interacts really weirdly with something in the core rule book that you didn't think about. So it's not even like, oh yeah, just tell people not to use these things together. And it's like, oops.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the thing that you have to worry about this is that there are both internal and external pressures here. So one of them is that ultimately, again, these are all definitely going to be updates that you make. And so you don't want to have a ton of updates for usability reasons.
Yeah.
Now, there's possibly, I don't know, let's say that there's 50 things in your 500-page book that could be strengthened and 50 things that could be weakened. And of those, the ones that are actually causing serious problems are 10 things. Those are all generally going to be things that could be weakened, not things that could be strengthened, unless something as big as an entire class is significantly underperforming. Why?
Because if one option is too weak and it's like, oh, there's one feat that's not great, then people could just not take that feat and it won't disrupt their game. But if there's one feat that's rampantly overpowered and everyone's taking it, then it's disrupting a lot of games.
Correct. The thing that is causing issues by being too strong is going to show up all the time because it's too strong. It's even worse if it's a spell and not a feat, then everybody in that entire tradition might just have it prepared all the time if it's busted. Multiple copies, or with a spontaneous caster casting it over and over again.
Or maybe it's in multiple traditions, and then it's
maybe it's in every tradition.
And then it can potentially mess up every spellcaster in the game.
Yep.
Yep.
And so you have to think about what is the impact. What is the impact of having something that was too weak of a spell? Just nobody prepares that spell. Mm-hmm. Sometimes even there's spells that are supposedly weak that are just not meant to be like a combat or adventuring spell. They're more of a lifestyle spell that were meant for like that were designed because of wanting to do world building or role playing things, which I know like Logan is often really interested in thinking about how does magic work in the fantasy world and how is it for everybody and not necessarily just for when you're going in and busting every door down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And finding interesting ways to use those types of spells and adventures is fun too.
For sure.
So then let's say that you find those 50 and 50. Do you just go in and say, I'm going to fix these 10 most busted things?
So generally you can't. But you have some pressure. So let's say you have 10 things that are wrecking the game. Mm-hmm. And you have another 10 things that really would be good if you remove them because they're causing some significant problems. Then 30 that are some maybe legitimately wrong, overpowered, but maybe they're not causing that many issues. Mm-hmm. Like they're just too strong, but they're not like completely eliminating all other results. They're just making any group that has it is doing a little bit too well, but there's still a reason to play other things. Mm-hmm. And then you have another 50 things, and 30 of them are just a little bit undercooked and under par on what they do, but they're still mostly fine. Then there's 10 that are like, ooh, these would barely ever be useful. And there's 10 that are just utter trash. Yeah. And they're like weapon specialization net, where you just literally make, or like there was an old feat that was like, that literally did nothing in Pathfinder 1. I can't remember what it was. It was one that even gave you a penalty that was like more than what you originally would have had. And it was literally counterproductive. Whoops. I think it was because probably whoever wrote the feat didn't know what the general rule was that the feat was implied upon, because that's not always easy to remember in Pathfinder 1. So, in general, like, there's some amount of tolerance for how many of these there can be and how burdensome it's going to be. And you don't know what that tolerance is exactly, right? It's like playing one of those games where you're rolling dice, and if you keep rolling and adding up your score, but if you get a 6 or both 6s or some not, then you were too greedy and you go down to 0.
So you don't know for the average, because of course every person's going to be different.
Oh, Xenarch remembered, it was Monkey Lunge. That was the one. That was one of the ones that was in Pathfinder 1 that caused more issues than it produced.
So you kind of got to guess like what is going to be the sweet spot for most of the people who are engaging with the content, because there are also going to be some percentage of folks who just say, I don't care about Errata, I'm not going to read it.
That's correct.
We're using my book. My group has one shared set of books, and that's what we use. The GM owns them. I bring them to the table whenever I play.
Right. So let's say that you decided, based on how many other errata you needed to fix that were just like not at all about power level balancing, that you had 15 slots for whatever reason. You're like, I don't know. I think we have 15 slots. Mm-hmm. In that case, generally what you should do is put in all 10 of the ones that it completely wrecked the game, and then, even though it would be nice to get 5 of those ones that cause serious problems, you probably should get 5 of the ones that are absolute utter trash that were in that bottom 10, so it doesn't look like you were just only making things weaker that needed to be made weaker.
Yeah, because then some people are gonna be like, well, I don't want to engage with the errata because all it ever does is weaken my characters.
Exactly. And that is something that is an example of a broader principle that you can use in your life, even if you are not an RPG designer who is creating errata. It's something that my advisor taught in a communication class back at MIT, which is, if the way that you are engaging with a particular person consistently is that you're always the bearer of bad news, or whenever you come to tell them something, it's always something bad, then they're going to develop an association that when they hear from you, they'll get even stressed because they'll know like,
oh gosh,
it's this person. What broke this time? And this is even true if it's not someone who is being like mean or complaining in any way. Like, you know, I've had a person who you know, would send me messages about things who, you know, is almost like you would say like a source that they have. If like something really bad or weird was happening like in the RPG scene, maybe they would send like a message of like, oh my gosh, this thing was happening. It was always bad news. Yeah. Right? And so then if I got another message from them, I'm like, oh crap, did something really bad go wrong? It turned out like eventually at one point it was like, no, it was just something fine.
It kind of starts to feel like you get a phone call in the middle of the night from your family and you know that something terrible happened.
It's like, who died?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so it's good. Basically, the lesson in this is that it's good to have a sort of wider band of communication with someone in the real world and for any purpose, where you just sometimes talk to them about something that is not only whatever's on fire or the bad news or the other things, so they don't come to mentally unconsciously associate you with bad news.
So you don't want folks to associate errata with bad news. The players in general to associate errata with bad news. So having, you know, some things that make things stronger and some things that make things weaker, it's like, oh, okay, that works out.
Obviously, if you could, you might want to fix all 100 of those things if you could without causing errata fatigue. Perhaps there's some things that are at the bottom of the list of the like the 30 that really didn't screw up the game that much in either direction that you're like, okay, fine. Even my perfectionism, I don't care about this, and it's a judgment call. But in general, like, you might want to do all of them. I'm obviously not saying that it's like that you want to leave behind these 10 that are, or the other 5 that were causing serious problems but not completely breaking the game, or these other ones where the effect is doing nothing or is very, very weak or like nobody would want. But we're talking here about having to balance it among multiple different genres.
And then it might be the case, like, let's say that your book is in publication for a lot of years and you go through multiple printing cycles, you know, maybe then on your next printing cycle, which is several years later, you can go in and fix the other 5. This is really 2 weeks, and then some of the ones that were in like that next category of this is too strong.
Exactly. And Kojo says no matter what changes in errata, there was someone who built their character around using that thing, and now they'll be upset. So this is actually fairly crucial because it's also another interesting and nuanced point. I've said it many times on this channel. I'll say it many times everywhere, which is, especially on the internet, but even really not just on the internet, communication is often focused around being a way to, you communicate when there's something you want, and when something's going wrong or is not the way you want it right now, you communicate to try to get it changed or to express that it's not what you were looking for. And so, when you issue errata that make a change that's not just like clearly like, well, this is just fixing a mistake that didn't even work at all before, the only thing you're going to hear is from people who did not like it, more or less. You
might occasionally hear from, like, one GM who's like, thank you, this thing busted my entire game.
So you might.
Occasionally, but not nearly as often.
Depending on what social media you're on, you might never be able to see that because it could get downvoted to oblivion. And the reason why is, just think about what it feels like to when things are changed and weakened in a game, especially a tabletop role-playing game where you are taking the role of this character, and even more so for classes, where that's like your character's role. People have an investment and personal identity in their character. And what that means is when something changes that they don't like, it's a type of grief, and people go through the stages of grief. They legitimately do. This is, I'm not trying to demean the other ways that grief are felt for things that are probably much larger than a tabletop RPG change, but they still go through the different stages of grief, like denial and anger and things like that.
Yeah, and so if people are really, really, you know, And the people the thing is, like, not everyone is going to have that experience, but the people who are most invested are the people who are most likely to post, and the people who are most invested are also the most likely to have like a strong reaction when something happens with their character.
Well, and here's the thing though, right? Let's say you're going through the stages of grief on this. Mm-hmm. And you're one of the people who's posting that, and then someone is like, thank goodness that was fixed. That was ruining the game. It's like, it's like, bless you to Company X for finally closing that loophole. Mm-hmm. That's not going to make you feel very good.
Yeah. And you're going to downvote that.
And to some extent, people know that. Mm-hmm. And so even someone who's very happy about the change, if they go on there and they see 40 people who are very upset about it, they might not want to, like...
wade into that.
I'm
happy that you're upset.
Some people are sensitive and to the fact that people are having grief and are like, I don't want to look like I'm a jerk. Some people will be like, maybe I'm the only human being in existence who thought that this infinite hit point combo was bad. Maybe most people like infinite hit point combos.
So then you're usually more likely to see it if people are like really going out and then they're like, developer, you suck because you did this, and then like someone coming in to defend the developer, it's like, well, I think this was good actually, but then it's like,
or if there's a death threat, which is rare but does sometimes happen, not always over errata, it can just be over almost anything. But when things go way too far, yes, you will see you'll be more likely to see pushback, but when it's just like general stages of grief, which does include anger, you're generally less likely to see pushback. And if you do, because of the fact that people who are grieving are more prevalent, if you're somewhere like Reddit where things can be up and down voted, you might generally see the people getting downvoted who are the ones who are going against the predominant sentiment of grieving at that time.
So then that's also a consideration of...
Sheppy mentioned the same thing in chat as we were saying.
Yeah. And that's also a consideration of, like, do you have the mental bandwidth to deal with the way that people are going to respond to you putting out errata?
Yep.
And the online spaces.
And then someone also mentioned in chat that, when content creators are calling unhappy people crybabies or making fun of them, that it doesn't go well. And that's absolutely true. That's why you have to respect their legitimate grief. And you don't want to look down on it and be like, well, this doesn't count. This shouldn't be able to count as grief. There are a lot of even more griefful things that are happening because... everyone has their own personal experience of grief, and you don't know what other things people are dealing with in their life where they wanted their tabletop RPG to be their escape.
And now their escape isn't working because they're feeling frustrated about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So that comment is very on the nose. You don't want to have a situation where there's adversarial feelings. You want to be able to accept and acknowledge the feelings from the people who are not happy. Yeah, because when
you're making the errata, people aren't sitting there being like, I'm going to make this errata because I know that I'm going to upset people and I like upsetting people. It's like, well, this is something that is would be causing issues for a large number of tables, and so, I think that making this change is in the best interest of the play experience for the player base as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's just a huge number of factors that get added into here. And here's another one that can be a little trickier. When I make an errata change in a Battlezoop product nowadays, now that I'm in Roll for Combat instead of Paizo, if I change something, I can also tell people... like that I am officially okay with them if they want to use the original version or even some third version. I can talk to them about that because Roll for Combat does not have like some kind of official organized play that has to use exactly whatever the most up-to-date thing is with the errata. Some companies do have some form of play where it has to be exactly what's in there. And that can cause that feeling of loss or grief to be worse.
Because if you have let's say you don't like a change and you can just talk to your GM and be like, hey, I'm not a fan of this change. Can we not apply this errata? And they might be like, yeah, sure. Or like, let's try to work out something in between. But in an organized play setting, that needs to, and things need to lock to the newest thing. So that's something that definitely we discussed a lot in the organized play team is, how do we apply these erratas, and, when it, and usually, is it enough just to retrain that option that was the one that changed, or does this have giant knock-on effects where it's like, well, this changed something, this changed the ability score required for this particular class, which means that people need to change their attributes, which means that then this changes all these other things, and like, do you just have to go back to this, let people rebuild down to the studs of their character?
And think about that, what Linda's talking about there, because, I've been, behind the scenes making errata decisions about what the errata will be. She's been making decisions about, like, what rebuilds or other repercussions would be in an official organized play program a lot. Think about what that means to acknowledge the decision that, this is going to be, you can rebuild your character down to the studs. Think about that. What that means, like, it's like that is a generous rebuild allowance.
But that means that, when you put that in, you put that in because you acknowledge that there are players out there who will say, my character is essentially dead because of this change. It is so transformative that I just cannot play them anymore.
I'm no longer playing. I don't know. We'll just say it was some kind of hypothetical combination between Leshy and Wood Kineticist that gave infinite hit points. There isn't really one at the time of this video or ever. But it's like, no, my Leshy Wood Kineticist is dead. It was entirely based on infinite hit points. Their name was even Infiny, and we made a lot of jokes about it. I'm now playing a Lizard Folk Oracle instead.
Because you're like, okay, well, I built them in this entire way because then, okay, yeah, sure. So the idea is that their AC is really low, but they have like this really regeneration combo, and that's how they survive. So like, everything I built was toward this, and like that's their entire shtick and all that kind of stuff.
Look, I get it. Like, I completely do. How a small change can make it so that a character that doesn't work in the story anymore, you need to retire the character. I've had it happen to me from an organized play change, even though I agree that overall it was a change that happened while I was at Paizo. I was like, yeah, this is a good overall change. One of my characters is, I'm not going to play them anymore. But like, so there were certain archetypes in Pathfinder 1st edition that made it so that your character could not read and write. Okay? And Pathfinders do have to report things in the Pathfinder Society. But I had a character who was from like a Kellid following with an oral tradition who would report and would give these like long oral reports, and was based entirely, like, a lot of the concept of the character was that the character was had the barbarian class, but cared about scholarship, but in a way that didn't involve reading and writing. And so when I gained the ability to read and write, I didn't necessarily want to play the character anymore because it just changed so many conversations he had with other player characters about like philosophy and tradition, other things like that. And even, some people were like, oh no, but we really like that barbarian. We want you to play him. Couldn't you just like pretend that he can't read and write still, even though it says that he can? And for me, that didn't really work because the character could read and write. So at that point,
the character's just pretending like
he's
he can.
Pretending that he
can't.
It's very different than if he actually couldn't.
Yeah.
And so like this is an example where that literally happened to one of my characters. Yeah. So I get it. I get how that can happen.
I wound up having a character have that happen to them because of a story change.
Yep.
Where, like, their entire backstory was based off of a portion of the canon that got retconned. It's like, well, the way, everything about this character and where she came from doesn't exist anymore. So.
Yep. Her character was someone who was, like, a Sarenrae worshiper, which was hidden in Taldor because it was illegal. But then it got retconned that Sarenrae worship was not illegal.
Yeah. And that was, like, why she did everything. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to play her in organized play games anymore. I'll play her in home games.
Because she didn't get a rebuild.
Yeah.
And also in some home games, one home game, she rebuilt her as an elf because the retcon was just like, well, it's not like they were never banned, but instead of saying it was banned now, we're going to say it was banned 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So she played an elf, even though the character was originally human, to be like, yeah, when I was a kid, I have the same backstory. It just happened 100 years ago to try to fix it out. But that was not something she could do in organized play because the retcon in the lore book did not come with an ancestry rebuild for the character. So there's all sorts of things that can happen in errata that you have to consider, and you have to consider people's feelings when you're doing it too. And let's see, people have been talking about this a lot in chat. And Rico mentions playing an MMO where they boosted a weak but situational spell, then 2 weeks later nerfed it more than it had been originally been at. And at that point, then he didn't want to play anymore, even though it was generally pro errata. That there are limits that even he felt, and yes, there are. We all have some limits on errata, probably from the perspective of a user. Even if we're someone who as a user wants errata, or someone who as a designer wants perfectionism.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Especially when the way that the errata is made doesn't agree with the way that we see the game, or we feel like, that errata takes away the spirit of this thing, or I don't think that errata was necessary.
Yeah, or like my example, I thought the errata was a good idea overall because I was not... my character was one that was really trying to engage with the philosophy of scholarship as it goes to this particular character and his culture, but I could easily see how a lot of the characters would just be ones who didn't want to follow the Pathfinder Society tenet of reporting and just played murder hobos, and then it was like, well, wait, we should read these documents, I not read Smash or something like that, right? We could encourage people to make characters who are just were being uncooperative and not doing the society's mandate.
Well, it kind of reminds me of some of the conversations when there was some concern on the organized play team about when with PF2 how goblins were going to become a core ancestry, and then the thought was if people wind up playing them in a way that is similar to the way that we've often portrayed them in our stories and our fiction, then that could be disruptive to the play experience at tables. And those concerns, it didn't wind up being that way, but it was something that we were thinking about.
I remember that organized play was very worried about that. There were multiple meetings, but honestly, I think it was good that those meetings happened because it made sure that we could refine the message that was given at Paizo. And that super refined message, thanks to the organized play team's concern, and it wasn't only the organized play team that was worried about that, allowed for a success.
I just was on the organized play team, and so we were talking
But
about
I would say that it was mainly the organized play team.
because we were also thinking about the fact that when strangers play together, then they don't have as much time to establish the social contract, and so therefore you might be more likely to run into issues where somebody who hasn't played very much, sees a story with a goblin in it, and they're inspired by that, and they want to play a character that's just like that, and then...
Yeah, and I think that...
someone else is playing Cavalier and they decide to attack their horse.
Because of those concerns, there was strong messaging about goblins that sort of went out to make sure people understood what was going on, what had been known before, what was true for the PC goblins. And the community really adopted it well and really wanted to make these cooperative goblins and show that not all goblins are stereotypes. Instead of the fear, which very justified, that if you didn't have the right launch... everyone would be like, this is my chance to play goblins that are just chaotic, evil, sadistic babies, basically.
Yeah.
Who are going to disrupt every adventure. And people wanted to show, I think they even wanted to prove they could use goblins responsibly. And they did. It was awesome. So, I think that... we have covered a lot of what we wanted to talk about the secrets of errata, including the ones that we came to the table with and ones that people asked about us in chat today. Do you have anything else, Linda?
I I think that one of the things that when you were talking before about Roll for Combat having the period where people have things before, I think that also gets somewhat into some of the things we talked about in another recent episode about playtesting and when you want to playtest and how to do that. So if you're interested in more of that conversation and haven't seen that episode yet, I recommend you check it out.
Yeah, you should definitely check that one out. I've seen people who were saying that they found that super helpful, both as someone who wanted things to be playtested and as someone who wanted to become a playtester. And that makes me feel happy that we gave some good feedback from both sides of that, since most videos would be only looking at one of the directions or the other. But Linda and I have extensively playtested for RPGs and run playtests for RPGs as well.
If you like what you've seen here today, please give us a like and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you'd like. And if you really like what we put out and you want to give us some money, thank you so much. You can hit the join button below the video to look for more information about
Become a leaf leshy.
Becoming a leaf
You can get those little pumpkin gourd leshies for the holiday season. Also, whether or not you do any of that stuff, because you don't have to be a subscriber or a member to chat, you can vote for our next episode. Either Build a Hazard Workshop, Ask Arcane Mark, Save My Game Q&A, Player Tools, The Power of Teamwork, Arcane Mark Plays, where we play some kind of a game, live or other. So hit 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 into the chat.
If you hit 5, please specify.
Oh yeah, you should specify. We can't just do other. And there was previously a vote for 4 from Math Guy Dave.
Math Guy voted for 4. Chevy voted for 3.
That's right. So we've got a 3 and we've got a 4.
And we have a leaf.
And a leaf. That's true.
For leaf leshy. 3-3.
There are
3 threes.
There are 3 threes.
4 threes. 2 4s, 4 threes.
5 threes. All right. I think the 3s have it, although there's actually a good number of people who are watching right now. And Bomb Wolf wonders, does someone have a game that needs saving? Well, hopefully if we did a Save My Game Q&A, then people would come who have questions that they want.
Yeah, so those would be either specifically issues that they are having in their games or that they've had in their games or things that they're wondering how to solve. 3's got it. There are so many 3s. Do we have 10 3s at this point?
9, I think.
Or 9, yeah.
Yeah, which is almost a record for number of votes that a particular thing has had. So awesome. Then that is it. Next Saturday's episode will be Player Tools, The Power of Teamwork. But you might want to join us on Tuesday when we talk about classes versus classless systems and the entire spectrum in between. Go strong classes versus weak classes. I don't mean in terms of power level, but in terms of like how much
clustered things are.
Exactly, how much they kind of define what you are, as opposed to just give some options that you can generally pick around through. So in different game systems. So don't miss those unless you want to miss them, in which case do miss those. And
it's up to
we'll
you
see
how
you later.
You want to spend your time, but we always appreciate when you choose to spend it with us. Take care, everybody. Have a great day / weekend / whatever
it
time
is
for you.
Bye.
Bye.